Hello. We are going to talk about the respiratory system. And fortunately, the respiratory system, and anatomically speaking, is not very complex. So this shouldn't take too long. So let's get to it. So brief introduction, we'll get to the function list later, but basically the respiratory system is for gas exchange. And the gases that we care about exchanging is getting oxygen and getting rid of or eliminating carbon dioxide. And so the respiratory system really facilitates the exchange of these gases between air, generally atmospheric air, and the gases in our blood. And so we're taking out the O2 and putting it in the blood, and we're taking the CO2 from the blood and putting it back out into the atmosphere. Where does that CO2 come from? Cellular respiration. Your cells are using the oxygen for cellular respiration to become the final electron acceptors at the end of the electron transport chain when you're making ATP in the mitochondria. And carbon dioxide is a byproduct of this system. So yeah, that's where the CO2 comes from. So a couple of points that really need to be made, anatomically speaking, right? You really need to understand this anatomically. And here's the deal. You have an upper respiratory system or tract, right? So upper respiratory tract, URT, and a lower respiratory tract, And here's the dividing line between the upper respiratory tract, and the lower respiratory tract. I'm going to try to make this a little straighter. And so you need to know what is part of the upper respiratory tract. Well, your nares, which is your nose and your nasal opening, nasal cavity, paranasal sinuses, because they're para with the nasal cavity, and then the pharynx. Now the pharynx has three parts to it, right? So here's your nares, your nasal cavity, and then here's the pharynx. And the pharynx is this, and the pharynx is going to have the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and then the one part where it shares with the larynx. And here's the larynx right here. And the larynx has the vocal folds. And so that's where you get laryngitis, because the vocal folds that are producing sound, that we use to produce sound, are in the larynx. And so when the larynx gets inflamed with a cold or virus, something that has mucus or irritation, it's then becomes laryngitis. So upper respiratory tract infections, you generally hear someone because their voices are altered and affected. Lower respiratory tract infections, now they involve from the trachea down to the bronchus or bronchi. Bronchi is singular, bronchus is plural, to the bronchioles, which are very small, all the way to the terminal bronchioles and the respiratory bronchioles, and then the alveolar lobules that are off the respiratory bronchioles. So that's lower respiratory tract. Now, if you, when a doctor puts the stethoscope up to your back, they are listening to the bronchioles. They're really listening to hear the bronchus and the bronchioles, and they're hearing if there's any sound. If there's sound, that means that there's some restriction. Maybe it's due to mucus, maybe it's due to pneumonia, maybe it's due to some kind of allergic reaction where the smooth muscle is contracting. But that's what they're listening to when they put the stethoscope on your back. When they put the stethoscope on your front, on your sternum or your ribs, they're listening to your heart valves. So that's the lower respiratory tract. And if you have an infection in a lower respiratory tract, it's bronchitis, it is pneumonia, it's something in that lower respiratory system. Now, the other two things is the conducting portion and the respiratory portion. Respiration refers to gas exchange. And so with gas exchange, we're talking about O2 and CO2. And so the respiratory portion is the portion that actually does the gas exchange. And that is only in the respiratory bronchioles that are connected to the alveoli and the alveoli. So at the very, very end, everything else is conducting. And so if we were to highlight this, this right here, the trachea is conducting, this is conducting. Well, all of this is conducting. And it goes all the way just to the alveoli. So most of what's the parts of the lung are conducting, right? So they're conducting. And then the respiratory portion is just at the very, 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 very end, right? The very alveolar lobes and the respiratory bronchioles. So understand that, kind of go through this, you know, this is an important slide for anatomy. Functions of the respiratory system, again, number one is gas exchange between the air and our blood. Why? Because we need oxygen for cellular respiration, which means make masses of ATP, and CO2 is byproduct, so need to get rid of it, right? So we're getting rid of CO2 and we're getting oxygen to basically make more ATP and create more CO2 as a byproduct. And so how do we do that? Well, we have to get that air to the respiratory portion, we have to move it, right? So that's another function. Besides gas exchange, we've got to get the actual air there for gas exchange. And then the 3 and 4 are protection. So we'll talk about the pseudostratified cilia, the mucus cells, those goblet cells. They're all trying to protect pathogens and pollutants from getting to the alveoli, the respiratory bronchioles in the alveoli, because they are very, very thin. One cell layer, simple squamous. It's great for rapid diffusion, but it's super delicate and can be broken down or kind of torn really easily. And so there's a lot of protection going on of trying to trap things before it gets down to the respiratory portion. Producing sound, that is done in your larynx, and we'll talk about that. So being able to produce all kinds of sounds, it's your respiratory tract. And then assisting in blood volume, blood pressure, and control of pH, right? So this really we go through when we study physiology. So these are physiology concepts. So you don't need to worry about that now. You just need to know it's a function. Know its function for anatomy. But when you get to physiology, you learn how it controls blood volume, blood pressure, and pH, right? So physio gets a little more complicated. All right, so protection. Again, the pseudostratified ciliated columnar, you have these little cilia and you have these mucosal cells or goblet cells that produce mucus, right? So this is mucus. And things get trapped in that mucus, and when you move air, right, so this is air up, it makes those cilia kind of push the mucus up, and so anything that you trap in that mucosal layer will get brought up to your pharynx, so you can get rid of it. That's one way. And you also will have phagocytizing cells. Oh, excuse me. All right. Going on down, the pharynx. So the nasopharynx again, right, where the nose opens up and you bring air in. The oropharynx is from the mouth that comes in. And then you have the laryngopharynx. And the laryngopharynx here has the epiglottis. So this right here is the epiglottis. And up until the pharynx, so the pharynx is shared by the respiratory tract and the digestive tract, meaning anything you put in your mouth, it's all connected, right? So that's why if you're laughing, or sometimes things go up your nose if it's in your mouth, because it can, right? It's connected in the pharynx. The pharynx connects your nose and your mouth. And then also has the esophagus, right? So here's the esophagus right here. And so at the level of the larynx here is where it splits into the esophagus and trachea, right? So there's the trachea. And the epiglottis, when you are chewing food and you want food to go down, right? So you want food to go down the esophagus, the epiglottis will close and block the tracheal opening. So nothing's going to go into your trachea and mess up with your bronchi or bronchioles. So food will go down the esophagus. And when you are talking, the epiglottis is up when you're breathing, right? Because you want air to, if you're talking or breathing, you want air to go down your trachea. And so that's why it's really dicey when you're eating and talking. Because when you're eating and talking, what is the epiglottis to do? Does it stay up so you can talk, or does it come down so you can actually swallow your food? It gets very confusing. So that's why there's choking going on, and it's not a good method, eating and talking. Okay, so the larynx. Now the larynx is where we have our Adam's apple. That is the thyroid cartilage, and then right below it, the cricoid cartilage. That is how we define larynx. This is showing you the epiglottis right on top. And then after the cricoid cartilage, you start tracheal rings. And so you have these hyaline cartilage. These are all hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage. Then we get to the lower respiratory system, right? So here's where you start having these vocal folds. Now, the larynx really is part of the upper respiratory, but it's right there on the border, and so this book is including it seemingly in both. The epiglottis, and they're showing you this is anterior and this is posterior, right? So again, it's going to close over the esophagus. Is back here. These vocal folds are going to open and close, and they're going to control how open and how close and how tight they are. And so you have these muscles that are controlling sound, and they're intrinsic laryngeal muscles, extrinsic laryngeal muscles, and the laryngeal ligaments. And so this is showing you regulation of tension, right, are the intrinsic ones, plus the opening and closing of the glottis. And then you have the laryngeal ligaments. And these ligaments can open or close to a certain dimension and be a certain tightness. And as air passes by the glottis and the vocal folds, you will produce sound. So the pitch of that sound is going to depend on the vocal cords or vocal folds and how tight they are, right? Their length and tension and how wide apart they are, that's diameter. Amplification of sound gets the help with our paranasal sinuses, but also how much air. So it's volume of air that passes by vocal cords. And that's where your diaphragm and your respiratory muscles come into play, is being able to amplify that sound. Now we get to the lower, truly the lower respiratory, right? And we're talking about the trachea. Trachea comes down, and at the level of the lungs, it's going to make its first split. So the trachea splits, and the first split we call the primary bronchi. You're going to have a primary bronchi go into the right lung and the left lung. So the primary bronchi are the first split. Things to note, the right lung is thicker because the heart is on the slightly to the left, and it makes the left lung a little thinner. The right lung tends to be a little shorter because the liver is on this side. So they have like different sizes and shapes. The right lung also has 3 lobes, and the left lung only has 2 lobes. So this is showing you lobe and lobe and lobe, lobe, lobe. So the right bronchi is steeper. So you can see it has a steeper decline than this one, than the left side. And it's a little bit wider in diameter. So if you were to accidentally keep that glottis open, epiglottis open, excuse me, and food or something goes down the trachea instead of the esophagus, because you were talking and your epiglottis was open, it generally is going to go to the right lung because of that. So that is kind of what this is showing you here. Now, each primary bronchi, as it goes into the lung, is going to split a second time, and those are called the secondary bronchi. So the second split off the primary bronchi, or the second split off the trachea, is the secondary bronchi. Then you're going to have another split, and that third split off the secondary are tertiary bronchi. Now, the thing about tertiary bronchi is everything downstream of those tertiary bronchi is now called a bronchopulmonary segment or lobe. So these are tertiary bronchi, and everything attached downstream, right? And so you can see these tertiary bronchi, and they're colored here, so you can see, right? So those are tertiary bronchi. So it's kind of like a 1, 2, 3. And that kind of just shows you a bronchogram. Again, the right lung has 3 lobes, a superior, middle, and inferior, and the left lung has 2 lobes. Did I say right lung has 3 lobes and the left lung has 2 lobes, just a superior and inferior. After tertiary bronchi, we then call them bronchioles, and they will eventually terminate, and they'll be terminal bronchioles. They're very small. And here's where you have a lot of smooth muscle. So in the bronchioles, you have a lot of smooth muscle. And if the smooth muscle relaxes, then it bronchodilates, gets bigger, right? So the diameter gets bigger. If it constricts, it's contracting the smooth muscle. And that means the diameter gets smaller. This affects airflow, right? So airflow decreases, airflow increases. So when it bronchodilates, you increase the airflow. When you bronchoconstrict, it decreases the airflow. Okay, so this is kind of showing you, right? You have a primary bronchi. Then you have two secondary bronchi. Then you have the tertiary bronchi, and it comes down to bronchioles. And those bronchioles get smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually they terminate. So these are terminal bronchioles here. Now where you start to see little alveoli appear on the bronchioles, those are respiratory bronchioles. They have alveoli on them. And then you have the alveolar lobules attached to the respiratory bronchioles. This is where gas exchange occurs, right here. So right here, yeah, I should probably redo that, shouldn't I? So this right here is where gas exchange occurs, right? So this is the respiratory portion. Now, a bronchopulmonary segment, in this case, would be this and everything attached. So that would be a bronchopulmonary segment. It's basically a tertiary bronchi and everything attached to it. The autonomic nervous system controls the smooth muscle, which bronchodilates and bronchoconstricts. So bronchodilation is actually the fight or flight or sympathetic. And bronchoconstriction is parasympathetic. And so we'll talk about that more in physiology as well. But this is controlled by the smooth muscle here. All right, so this slide kind of gets down to it again. You have the trachea, you have the primary bronchi, you have the secondary bronchi, then you have, again, the tertiary bronchi, and this is showing you a bronchopulmonary segment all the way down to the terminal bronchiole, and then you have the respiratory bronchiole and the alveoli, so that's the respiratory portion here. And this is showing you, here's the respiratory bronchiole, And then here's an alveolar lobule attached. And here are the pulmonary capillaries. So pulmonary capillaries. And as it's going, remember, pulmonary arteries are going to be the blue because it's deoxygenated blood here. And as it's passing by, there's gas exchange here. And you're loading up with oxygen. And so the pulmonary veins have new oxygen in it, right? And so pulmonary veins are going to be red, pulmonary arteries are going to be blue because the whole point is getting new oxygen attached to those hemoglobin molecules and getting rid of the carbon dioxide. The other thing I want to bring up is that you need to remember the pleural cavities, right? So in the thoracic body cavity, you have the pleural cavities, right? A right and a left, and the pericardial around the heart. So we're talking about pleural here because it's surrounding the lungs. So the inner membrane, right, serous membrane, is the visceral pleura. Then here is the pleural cavity, and then you have the outer membrane, which is the parietal pleura. So please go back over. You do need to know the thoracic body cavity membranes. So again, no. Pleurisy, you can have extra fluid here in the pleural cavity, and that's called pleurisy. And it can make it hard to breathe. It hurts. These are things that you can get when you have infections. As far as the alveoli, so there's air in here in these alveoli, like where you bring air all the way into the alveolar, right? So atmospheric air. And you have these type 1 cells. They're the simple squamous cells. So this is type 1, right? All these are type 1 cells. And so this is showing you, these are the type 1 cells. And then you have a thin endothelial cell here. And the two of these together make up the respiratory membrane. And so the respiratory membrane is a type 1 simple squamous cell here and the endothelial cell. And so there's very quick gas exchange, right? So there's air and it's bringing oxygen and getting rid of carbon dioxide. It's got to be a thin membrane for diffusion to occur quickly and efficiently. So anything that increases the thickness of the respiratory membrane is going to cause problems that's like COVID. COVID lowers someone's oxygen saturation because that respiratory membrane can become thicker. And so gas exchange becomes harder in the amount of time that air is in the alveoli and the capillaries are there. And so you have just less gas being exchanged within the same time period if that respiratory membrane's thicker. And so you can end up with lower oxygen saturation. The other cells are these type 2 cells. They kind of look like fuzzy little guys here. They produce surfactant, and surfactant starts being produced around 37 weeks of fetal development. And that's when a baby is able to breathe on its own, blow up the lungs on its own, because you need surfactant to be secreted by these type 2 cells. And what surfactant does is it enables your alveoli to blow up like a balloon. So what surfactant does is, there is water in air. And so you have these water molecules, and water molecules are polar and they like to stick together. So if there's water in there, it's wanting to stay all next to each other, and it's pulling the sides of the alveolar inward. And we call that surface tension. And what surfactant does is it comes in and it breaks apart like a detergent, these water molecules, and so they don't want to stay together. So when the air comes in, it will allow this to expand because those water molecules aren't pulling in and trying to hang out together in the middle of the alveoli. And so surfactant's necessary in order to expand the alveoli because you need a large surface area for gas exchange. So you want a thin respiratory membrane, you want a large surface area for quick gas exchange. And so surfactant helps break up those water molecules, i.e. decrease the surface tension by breaking apart those water molecules. And so the whole type 1 cells can expand out without having anything pulling on it. As far as ventilation, respiratory muscles, your primary respiratory muscles are your diaphragm. And for bringing air in or inspiration, your external intercostals, or bringing air in. Your diaphragm's really the main one. Your diaphragm is usually a dome-like muscle. And when you contract it, it flattens. And you'll learn how this draw airs in. So this is a relaxed diaphragm muscle. So we'll talk about how that all works when we get to physiology. External intercostals make your ribs go out, and so it increases your thoracic cavity. If you want to get rid of air or expiration, you just relax your diaphragm, right? And it goes back up. Or you can use your internal intercostals. It brings the ribs down and decreases the thoracic cage. So your primary respiratory muscles, diaphragm, and the external intercostals. And then your exhalation, you can use your internal intercostals, and then you start using accessory muscles. So these are accessory muscles. The more airflow you need, so the more air you need to flow and the faster you need it to go, the more muscles you start to use. So quiet breathing, we just use the diaphragm. We contract it and then we let it relax. If you need a little bit more air, you start using the external intercostals and the internal intercostals. And then if you start needing more and more air, you start using these accessory muscles. That's why you tend to see people using their neck and their chest and their abdominal area to really move airflow. Again, you don't need to know how it happens for anatomy, just that these are the muscles involved. We'll talk about the mechanisms for breathing when we get to physiology. But this kind of goes through it, and you can go through inhalation and you can go through exhalation. Centers for the brain that are controlling the rate and depth of these muscles are in the pons and the medulla oblongata, so your brainstem. And there are receptors that are monitoring the volume and pressure and also the pH. And so there are mechanoreceptors and chemoreceptors that are monitoring to tell the pons and the medulla oblongata if you need to breathe more or you can breathe less in terms of number of times. And that is it for chapter